to hear our commander-in-chief say that our economy is strong as hell when we have people right now considering second jobs. What's up, everyone, and welcome to Make Your Money Matter. I'm your host, Brad Barrett. I'm also a managing director and partner here at One Capital Management. And I'm here on this show each and every week to help you have a better relationship with your finances because, after all, your money matters. And this week, I want to talk about baseball. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it have to do with my money? Well, number one, it's October. The baseball playoffs are underway, which I don't know about you, but I love baseball playoffs. And my son, Brooks, who's turning 7 here in December, he's actually now on his 3rd season of baseball. And I'll be candid with you. Growing up playing hockey my entire life, I did not expect my son to take to baseball as much as he has, but he loves it. But with these playoffs, these baseball playoffs going on, it got me thinking about, of all things, umpires. Why? Well, with so many polarizing statements in media being blasted at us basically every day about inflation, recession, the volatility, including what our administration stated just days ago, and I'll touch on that later, but it got me asking the question, who is the umpire of these topics? Who should we listen to? An even more direct question, I would say, is who is the umpire, if you will, of economics? So today we're going to discuss this and more on the Make Your Money Matter show, but before we do, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. All right, let's get into it. So, as many of us know, baseball umpires are the managers of the game. And really, for over 100 years, it was their decision on play calls. And that was it, basically. And to quote President Truman, the buck stops here. There was no replays and phone-ins to the baseball command center, if you will, to decide, controversial calls. So, to lead off today's discussion, I want to talk about a Hall of Famer, a Hall of Fame umpire by the guy named Bill Clem. Now, for those of you who know this baseball history, Bill Clem was an innovator. He actually became the first of his profession as an umpire to wear a chest protector and actually use the visible signs with his calls that we all now see on TV or at the game every time. Now, he was actually called, his nickname was the Old Arbiter. He was also known for his stellar work behind the plate, and he actually also taught a lot of his fellow umpires to stand just slightly to the side of the catcher to get a better view of the incoming pitch. This was all from him. And he was also known for, I think one of my favorite traits of his was taking absolutely no gruff from managers and players. And to that wit, there's a famous story, for those of you, again, who know the history of baseball and of the original umpire, let's call it, or the Old Arbiter, as he was called, Bill Clem, that after a catcher actually caught the ball, Clem sat basically crunched and silent, and a moment had actually passed before the confused batter actually turned around and asked, so what was it, a ball or a strike? And he goes, Sonny, it ain't nothing till I call it. You gotta love old school umpires, right? Now, versions of the story have been used by scholars to explain interpretation. The idea that while there is a rule book, it's ultimately up to the umpire to decide the balls and the strikes. So those who love baseball like me aren't necessarily, aren't undeniable truths. Now, this is until, the Major League Baseball begins using an automated strike zone, which apparently they're supposed to do next season. I digress. But here's my tie-in for today. It's also useful in economics, at least when it comes to explaining the interpretation of how we define certain things. I'm going to bring this up again this week on the subject of defining if we are in a recession, which is one thing, and whether or not we're there right now as the US. Now, those of you who listen to me, especially over the past couple months, I've been talking a lot about this, and I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here. I just want to go into some things here as it relates to what we're still seeing here in October, November. Now, it depends on who you ask, but for those folks, however they answer the question, they're all batters and catchers. That's what I want to share here today. They're batters and they're catchers. They are not the ultimate arbiter here, like our friend Bill Clem. The umpire, if you will, is the National Bureau of Economics Research, the NBER. Now, again, I've talked a lot about this over the past couple months. There are 8 members of the NBER, and they're the ones who actually assign whether or not we're in a recession. They are the foremost economists in our country from the top academic institutions in the nation. They're the ones that decide this. Now, the NBER's rule book, the definition of recession, is actually quite broad. And I want to quote something here. A significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and that lasts more than a few months, end quote. That's their definition. Now, That could mean consecutive quarters of negative GDP like we just experienced, which a lot of people think that that's the number one indicator, and really to many, the only indicator of a recession, but that's just not the case. In fact, since 1948, each time the GDP has fallen for at least 2 straight quarters, the NBER eventually declared a recession. Not right away, but eventually they declared a recession. So the NBER doesn't use GDP as a major part of its decision. That's going to be shocking to many people, and I talked about this about a month ago as well. They rely on factors that are far beyond that. Factors like personal income, the personal income minus the transfer payments, non-farm payrolls, employment really is what's gauged by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, real consumption of expenditures, sales, mainly sales adjusted to price fluctuations, and overall industrial production. Now, considering all of that and why I'm bringing it up today, especially with the bustling jobs market like we've been seeing, the NBER has not officially declared a U.S. recession. Now, many of you are thinking right now, a couple months ago when they were talking about the administration right now redefining the word of recession, I've been pretty candid about this, saying like they just had a bad PR person, in my opinion. And frankly, that's their entire administration. Most administrations don't have the best PR, to be fair, right? Because it's really the NBER that defines it. They just got ahead of it and looked like, frankly, idiots, in my opinion, because they needed to go through them first and define what they were trying to say, because basically the media took that and said, what are you trying to redefine the word? And everyone kind of, grabbed onto that. But here's the thing. If the NBER eventually does declare a recession, if they do, it won't likely, in our opinion, here at One Capital, it won't likely happen until next year, 2023, when there's enough supporting data and current data right now is revised. They do that. Now, let's put all this in perspective here for a second. The world economy has experienced 5 global recessions over the past 7 decades, 1975, 82, 91, 2009, and then in 2020, which was just lasting a few months, by the way, and that was due to the pandemic, as we all know. Most people forget that. Now, during each of those recessions, annual real per capita global gross domestic production, yeah, that's a full sentence right there, they all contracted. This was also accompanied by a weakening of other key indicators of economic activity. The recessions were nearly simultaneous around the world, with severe economic and financial disruptions that hit many countries, not just the United States. Now, going back to 2009 for a second, I want to note something. The Great Recession, as we've come to know it, set off basically by the global financial crisis, was by far the deepest and most synchronized of the 5 recessions. It was at the epicenter of the crisis. The advanced economies around the world all felt the brunt, meaning countries like ours, America, saw it. Now, in contrast, most emerging markets, relative to developed markets, and even some developing economies, not developed, but developing, weathered that recession relatively well and actually delivered a stronger recovery than after the previous global recessions. Now, if a recession, by the way, and I'm bringing this up for a point here, if it is declared next year, let's just talk about it again here for a second. I've been mentioning it for, again, the past couple months. Really, if a recession is declared, what will that mean for you? That's really what you care about. That's why you're talking about it at your water cooler conversations at work or with your friends. What will it mean for you? Will it change your outlook? My answer personally, and I've been sharing this a lot with our clients here at One Capital, is no. I know I'm paying more at the gas pump. I know I'm paying more at the grocery store. I know basically everything around me, and like you, is going up in price. I see also the volatility in the markets, and I know that we have some negative contraction going on with global supplies, global domestic production. It's around us. I don't necessarily need the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, to tell me whether or not we're in a recession. They will eventually, because they're, again, the arbiter of it, but it's not going to change how I view things. We will likely see it next year looking backwards, but it's not going to necessarily, again, change how we here at One Capital Management, and really for you watching or listening, really should manage or trade your assets. Now, there's more to that point, obviously. My point in saying it doesn't change our outlook or what is it, the question of what does it mean for you. We need to be disciplined and get through the volatility. Let me give you an example. We'll use the aforementioned Great Recession in 2008, 2009, which again got its moniker for a reason. It was widely viewed as the hardest hitting since the Great Depression. So for context, real quickly, the Great Recession lasted 18 months, far longer, by the way, and the average is about 6 to 12 months since World War II, longest by far. And a lot of us, I bring that up because a lot of us forget that nowadays. We expect things to recover like yesterday, like super quick. I mean, in 2020, we saw that. We saw the V-shaped recovery from the pandemic, and from the market standpoint. And we're like, okay, we want to see that again. Right now, I would want to say, I'm going to share this openly for those who are watching, listening here. We're having a little bit of investment fatigue. We can be honest and candid with ourselves. Are you having some fatigue, expecting this to be better tomorrow? And you're like, why isn't it? And it's kind of getting really elongated here because we're used to things happening so expeditiously nowadays, because the average recession in terms of time periods are between 6 and 12 months. And right now, depending on where you look at it, it's a little bit of a subjective notion here, but we're about 8-9 months in here. Again, that's subjective, but the 08 financial crisis, the 09, which became again known as the Great Recession, that lasted almost 18 months, which is why it became again called the Great Recession. And here's what I want to present as really an extreme scenario, probably far more dramatic than we or most experts would anticipate. But let me give you an example here. If you had invested $1 million with us here at One Capital Management, we'll use our numbers. $1 million with us using our balanced composite returns, which is roughly a 60% equity, 40% fixed income. And we look at a history of our balanced composite returns. And if we invested this $1 million in December of 2007, now you're probably thinking, well, why December of 07? This is probably the least opportune time to invest because by February of 09, it was at the lowest point. So you invested at the high and you get the low. So December 2007 is the highest point, and February 2009 was basically the lowest point. But if you invested $1 million, your investment would have fallen to around $662,000. That's a 33% drop. Pretty dramatic, right? But we, like many of you watching and listening, invest for the long term. That's how we invest. And right about that time, the inevitable was happening. This time between 07 and 09, the economy was adjusting. Companies had shifted to current circumstances, and at that time, and things began to turn for the better. Remember, this didn't happen overnight. I think we need to remind ourselves of that a lot. So starting that February 09, the market moved steadily, not consistently, but steadily forward. And your investment, my $1 million example here, would have recovered to the original $1 million by October of 2010, and then grown to a little over $2.4 million by the end of 2021. That's equal to 141.7% appreciation. I did the math. You're welcome. I did the math of your original investment, which is also 264% gain from the low, which all that comes out to a 6.5% annualized return over the 14 years. Now, even looking at a possible recession through the eyes of someone like Eeyore, my kids are really into Winnie the Pooh right now, Eeyore, the internal pessimist, as we all know him, that's a pretty sunny outcome I just gave you as an example. Now, obviously, nothing here is promissory. These are historical numbers, but I bring it into context for you right now because if we do slip into a recession, which again is not for certain, but we do believe here at One Capital Management, I want to openly say we believe it'll actually be mild by historic standards. A lot will. Again, to that statement though, a lot will depend on the Fed and other central banks and how they raise interest rates and how they're choosing to be hawkish and curtail the inflation number. I mean, the Fed's number one goal, remember, is to bring down high inflation, especially right now. They've stated that. And we should see a substantial drop in the next few months. They'll likely not, going all the way back to their 2% goal that they have. And we'll get into that later. But I want to talk about something that's come up in the past probably week or so. It's a pretty hot topic. I know I mentioned at the top of the show, a lot of people have been talking about in the media. The statement that the president made while eating ice cream in front of reporters that basically put the media in a frenzied debate. Now, if you haven't seen the clip, we're going to roll it for you here.
Just one more economic one. Are you concerned about the strength of the dollar right now?
I'm not concerned about the strength of the dollar. I'm concerned about the rest of the world. Does that make sense?
Can you explain that?
Yes. Our economy is strong as hell. The internals are. Inflation is worldwide. It's worse off everywhere else than it is in the United States. So the problem is the lack of economic growth and sound policy in other countries, not so much ours. And that's how it's worldwide inflation. That's consequential.
You're giving a speech next over here.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. Now, first and foremost, look, I find it ironic that the president is making this comment while eating ice cream. Why? Well, the latest consumer price index found that June ice cream prices were up 12.5% over the last year at an increase of 3.1% from the prior month. The overall, by the way, CPI rose 1.3% in June alone, bringing last year's price gains to a sizzling 9.1%. I mean, this is the fastest annual pace since November of 81. But I digress. Forget the ice cream for a second, okay? Honestly, as of late, as a fellow citizen of the United States, I actually feel for this man sometimes because I feel like their PR just needs to get him off the camera in these candid moments. Because he even had to state the question. He's like, does that make sense? No, it does not. And here's why. Number one, by the way, this will always be an unbiased show because the reality is what I care about is economic data and really focusing on the data and the facts, okay? Why did this get reaction so much? It wasn't because he was eating ice cream. It wasn't because of the irony that entails the fact that he was eating something that's literally gone up in price in the past month. Okay, I'll just move off of that for a second. What's so reactionary to this for many Americans on both sides of the aisle, by the way, to hear our commander-in-chief say that our economy is strong as hell when we have people right now considering second jobs. I mean, there was a report on Bloomberg just the other day about how over 50% of Americans are considering a second job. I mean, you cannot come out, in my opinion, as a leader on any side of the aisle and say that we are strong as hell and be so commanding like that when half the country is hurting, can't pay for bills they used to have, carpooling with people because gas is too expensive and you won't release gas reserves. Again, another subject matter entirely. But I think it's really important to look at the comment as a whole in the sense of what he's saying. Now, he was trying to say, and I do agree with him like this, abroad and internationally, they are feeling it more than we are. That is a fact. You can look at the numbers. That is true. Now, there's some geopolitical environments involved with that. But the reality is, our commander-in-chief, what we care about is how we are doing here first. We have to take care of ourselves before we can take care of anybody else. It's like the airplane analogy when you're a parent. You know, they tell you put your oxygen mask on first before you put your kids. I mean, you're thinking as a parent, you're like, why would I do that? But then you're like, if I'm passed out, I can't help them, right? So we need to take care of ourselves as a country first to be able to then say, okay, we got to help people abroad. Don't even get me started on the, issue going on abroad that's kicked up in January, February of this year. But the reality is the reaction that came from this was largely because it was almost hurtful. It was hurtful for someone to not really walk in the shoes like many of us are walking in, I feel like. And I think many of you share that opinion. Now, again, this isn't a political statement, but it was something I know as a fellow human being, a fellow American that felt the same way you did. To hear that. The other side of this, though, is there is some truth to what he is saying. We do have some strong numbers. I mean, the reason why we haven't, the NBER, as I mentioned earlier, hasn't declared we're in a recession because we still have corporate profit growths that are positive. We still have GDP numbers that they're negative, but they're not when you add in certain things and look back and discount them in certain ways. I mean, the US economy, if you think about it, is a strange place right now. Jobs growth is slowing, but demand for workers is strong. Inflation is high, but not as high as last spring. I mean, consumers, you and I, are spending more in some areas, but cutting back in others. Job openings are high, but also falling, while layoffs are low. And well, it depends on what indicator you want to watch. Again, the indicators are a few. There's not just one. I mean, this is just one snapshot of where the economy stands, but based on certain analysis of various indicators, and you compare those to historic levels and whether they've been, getting better or worse in recent months. There's no universally accepted definition of a good or strong as hell number on any indicator of our economy. Me being a nerd with a economist background, we're all going to disagree on many things when you look at all the items and indicators that are out there. Even in the best of times, it can be hard for an administration or an economist to get a handle on what's happening in an economy with 150 million workers and $20 trillion worth of annual output. And these are by far not the best of times. I mean, the pandemic and its ripple effects are continuing to disrupt global supply chains and basically keeping millions of Americans out of work. I mean, the war abroad has pushed up gas and food prices and added a whole new source of uncertainty. The Federal Reserve is hawkish and is trying to beat back the fastest inflation in decades and basically threatening to cause a recession in the process. I mean, by one common definition, the United States is already in a recession because simply gross domestic product has declined for 2 consecutive quarters. And most economists, consider that definition too simplistic, which is our point here, and would rather and prefer to look at a broader array of indicators across a variety of categories. They also say that to understand how the economy is doing is, it is important to consider both levels and rates of change. It matters, for example, not only whether unemployment is low or high, but also if it is rising or falling. So, our commander in chief here coming and saying that the economy is strong as hell, my economist brain picks up and is like, especially while you're mumbling through ice cream that's obviously gone up in price. It's hard, man. You have to also consider the latest data that we go through every day in historical context. I mean, you look at these graphics, you have to understand things are rising and falling. You cannot take data in two-dimensional format. It's much more dynamic and three-dimensional. So basically, I want to share it this way. Many people were reacting to that clip that the media just went on a frenzy with. And I just want to share very openly that with any clip you're looking at, like the reason why you reacted to it was both emotional and rational. The emotional side was you're just like, really, guy? I mean, have you walked in my shoes at all, what I'm dealing with right now? And the logical side is like, let's say he's right on one of those categories. Well, there's like umpteen different categories that could contradict that one area that says he's strong as hell. So it's like, you can't take it for a grain of salt. You have to look much further. Us as portfolio managers do that. A good advisor will look past them and say, okay, what does that number actually mean? You don't want to just blanketly state, the economy is strong as hell. It's just not necessarily the way you want to communicate. So putting the market here in perspective, we should remember the markets are looking towards the future. They don't look behind us. They look forward. And I always tell people this when it comes to investing, like the markets, like the people who set the policies, the Federal Reserve, they're always looking forward. They're always forward-looking companies. Analysts are forward-looking. We don't want to look through our rear view mirror while we are driving. We want to look through the windshield. So consider that when you're talking about your investments. So just like in February of 2009, when there were 4 months, by the way, of the recession still ahead, the markets turned positive and began a very long and very prosperous run for many investors. Now, another stat I mentioned for the past couple of weeks, well, I want to bring it back up here. Those of us that are, a little longer in the tooth, let's say, have lived through, again, at least 5 recessions, 5 of them. They're as unavoidable as death and taxes, but they often correct economic imbalances, which enable a return to growth. That's the way markets work. If they always went up, you wouldn't need people like me. You wouldn't need to fear about money. You wouldn't need proper diversification or active management. You would just know, I'm going to go put $1 in and I'm going to get more out later. But that isn't how it works. Discipline and discernment win out. They often, again, these recessions, they often correct economic imbalances, which enable, again, a return to growth and what we'll call a misallocation that ends a misallocation of investment capital. Remember, I'm bringing that up because if you remember the housing and .com bubbles, it's a misallocation of some investment capital and realignment. And with asset prices driven down, like we're seeing right now, it actually provides a lot of opportunities. I've shared this many times, this subconsciously. I'm not sharing anything you don't know here, but if you see something that was trading at $20 and now is at $15, assuming that the company's not going bankrupt, and that's a pretty good price. So why do we not see that for everything in our portfolio and still have a long-term view? One of the main things is, in a lot of the phone calls and discussions I've been having lately, and likely you're thinking the same thing and watching here, is our emotions. We're reading things so fast and everything looks, so glim and all gloomy and this doom and gloom that's out there. It's just around us, and it's hard for us to separate the two, logic and emotions. That's where good management comes in. And by the way, if you're a client listening here at One Capital, that's where we do our quarterly reviews. And again, if you have questions, as always, reach out to us. That's what we're here for. Now, real quickly, before we end the show today, some quick examples. I want to bring up what I mean by ample opportunities for long-term investors, which hopefully is you. Some items that we own that we actually see value in, just to give you an example, like Apple, for example, was just above $3 split adjusted at that point in February of 2009. It is now valued at $177 at the end of last year using the same dates. February 2009, Pfizer was another one. The company went from $11 to $59. Target, $27 to a whopping $231. Now, these are just examples of historical time periods. Doesn't mean they're going to do that again, but you can see value. Something we've talked about heavily here is things like price to earnings relative to companies that we own. Finding value, my friends, is what we as portfolio managers are doing right now because there is value to be seen. We just have to find it. It's not across the board, but we need to find it and invest in it. And staying long and understanding that, we have to use diversification and weathering the storm, this volatility that we're in right now. Look, recessions are tough for everybody. I'm not going to just, blanket over and say it's just hunky-dory, all is good. I know sometimes I sound like the forever optimist here, but I don't get paid to be a pessimist or an optimist necessarily. But look, recessions are tough. They're tough for everybody. People lose jobs. Some businesses go bankrupt. Public budgets are basically completely strained. I mean, these things all happen in the best of times too. Don't forget. But the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research itself, assures us that, and I quote, expansion is the normal state of the economy. Most recessions are brief. Again, the NBER historically has stated themselves, expansion is the normal state of the economy. And again, most recessions are brief. There's nothing that can be done to sway the NBER's ultimate decision on whether or not we've hit a recession, but we can keep our spending and our debt down, have emergency funds on hand, and more importantly, stay invested. We talk about this often in our planning discussions here at One Capital, and you've definitely heard me say this: live below your means as best to your ability and manage your debt appropriately and stay long, stay invested. Now, to end this week's show, how I started, let's remind ourselves, and again, it's October, it's baseball playoff season, baby. Let's bring some joy and some love back into our life and enjoy our time that we get with the breath in our lungs, every day that we get with our families. That is important. And to paraphrase the old arbiter, the Hall of Fame umpire, Bill Clem, don't try to manage the umpires, manage the game. Same can be said of your investment philosophy. Now, before we go, if you found anything helpful today and want to learn more, you can visit our website at onecapital.com, or you can also scan the QR code on the screen with your smartphone. It'll get you right there. You can also call or text us. We want to help. Listen, there's no pressure here. We don't treat people like a number. In fact, we value relationships. It's the lifeblood of what we do. So click, call, or text us today. If you're not following us on social media, you should be. You follow us on Make Your Money Matter. We are sharing great information on all of our social media platforms. And as I often say, if you enjoy the show, if you like the show, share with someone you like. And if you don't like it, I guess share with someone you don't like. But until next time, always remember, make your money matter.